Good evening and welcome to this next session of our summer series here at Center Hill. Actually, we're beginning a new month, July the 1st. That's kind of hard to believe, but here we are. Which means then our emphasis is changing a little bit this month. We are staying within the broader field of emotional and mental issues. But for the month of July, we're going to be focusing more on in the area of addictive behaviors, addictions. And so, again, we begin each month, the first two Wednesdays of the month, with a professional who has expertise in the field. Like last month, we had Charlie Jackson with us talking about anxiety and depression. This month, we have with us Craegan Williams. Craegan is a licensed professional therapist. He works with the Capstone Therapy Center, which is located down in the Searcy area. But Craegan also has other ties, as most of you already know, to Center Hill, as he is married to the former Jenna Tripp Williams. And so we see Jenna and Craegan around here from time to time. But anyhow, we're glad to have Craegan with us to provide for us professional expertise in this field. And then we'll finish off the month with the remainder of the Wednesday nights with some gospel preachers who will be addressing the subject, but coming at it from the biblical perspective. And so we're praying that both of these approaches are going to prove to be very helpful and beneficial to us. So we're looking forward to the presentation tonight, then as well as next week as Craegan talks to us about addictions, and particularly, I believe, this evening in regard to substance abuse. We all are aware of, know people who struggle with these matters. One of the unintended, unexpected consequences of this pandemic and our having to deal with it, and people being at home much more than is normal, what we would consider normal. Addictive behaviors have really increased significantly. And so this is something that is quite pertinent for us and relative to our time in which we're living. It always was before, and it certainly is now as well. So we want to give our attention now to Craegan.
Well, good evening to everyone. My name is Craegan Williams, and tonight I'm going to be presenting a lesson mainly on drugs and addiction and what that entails, what that looks like. So first, I just want to thank the elders of Center Hill for allowing me this opportunity and this chance. It is something I'm very passionate about, and I just really am excited to talk about this issue with people who want a better understanding of what it is. So my hopes are a couple of things in this video. Is one, you get a better understanding of what substance use disorders are. Two, what your role and your responsibility is to maybe help someone in that regard, but also to help you understand really what addiction is and to see it differently. And so that's really my main hopes for those videos. And the last little nod I want to give is to my father-in-law, just so he remembers. No, in all seriousness, I'm very, again, honored to do this. So thank you so much for letting me speak on this topic. So let's begin. My training, my background. I am a licensed professional counselor, a licensed marriage and family therapist. I have accreditations in CSAT. Which is Certified Sexual Addictions Therapist. I'm right now currently getting my credentials for CTT, which is Certified Trauma Therapist, and I've been EMDR 1 and 2 trained. Again, what that really means is I've had a lot of training and a lot of background and understanding what really addiction is about and really the best way to treat it. So let me go into a little bit of the clientele I work with, just to, again, give clarity. I work at a treatment center called Capstone. We're located in Judsonia, Arkansas, and we work with young adolescent males between the ages of 14 to about 24. And what we do is we really try to help them understand their own addictive behaviors because, one, We do not call them addicts or see that they have an addiction. And the main reason why I say that is because their brain is really young. It still has a lot of neuroplasticity, gray matter, which means that ability to change. And so our hope is to help them make sense and understand themselves, but also to have their families help and understand what they've gone through that has led and put them in those events and situations. And a lot of that looks at resolving past traumatic issues that really just haven't been dealt with. So I say all that to kind of give a frame of reference of where I come from and the clientele I work with. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is going to be coming from those experiences, but it's also going to be coming from the information that we typically use to help our clients to help understand their own addictive behaviors and really how they continue to move forward and get out of those addictions. So before I begin, what I really want to go into is paradigms. Paradigms are models, and in layman's term, the way I best understood it is the way that you see things, which is also the way you treat things. For me, any addiction that I'm looking at, I'm going to be looking at it as an intimacy disorder. This is something that I really attributed to the CSAT trainings that I went to. Dr. Patrick Carnes was the one who really developed a lot of the assessments we use, the PTSIR, the SDI. Again, these are assessments that I know really maybe don't mean anything unless you've taken them yourself. But he's someone who has done a lot of research into people who have had addictions, who have had sexual addictions, who have also acted out and used substances, but he interviewed them and he gained a lot of information from them on what occurred to them and how they ended up in the places that they did. So really, he's someone that has really helped us, but also helped me better understand what really addiction is and helped created what we call the ITAP community. Again, better understanding of what trauma is and how to best help and serve any type of addictive behaviors. And so I really want to come back to the point of intimacy or addiction is an intimacy disorder. So I want to first off start with research because that's going to be my main friend in some of this. I want to start with a research that was recently done by Cigna and was published in the Wall Street Journal. And the title of it is The Loneliest Generation. And so some of the findings that they've found, because they interviewed 20,000 adults, and they used from UCLA this loneliness scale to tell scores between 20 to 80. And really, they identified those that scored really above a 43 as being self-prescribed as lonely. Why do I bring that up? Well, the findings found that 43% of the participants, so that's 2 in 5 Americans, sometimes or always felt isolated or that their relationships were not as meaningful. Additionally, 27%, so another 1 in 4 Americans, rarely or never felt, though, that there were people that they really understood them or that they connected with. And really only 53% of people felt like they weren't lonely. Again, why do I bring this up? I come back to addiction is an intimacy disorder. So right now, we are dealing with a generation, a population that is feeling more lonely than they have in the past. All that being said is we're going to be looking at, okay, here is a prime setup of finding an addiction or finding some way maybe to cope and deal with some of these internal issues. And I'm going to get into more of some external factors that would help create someone who's going to be in an addiction, and also give some feedback from my own experience of ways that I've seen and treated addiction, but also to what have been some of the presenting problems or issues that I've seen with my clients. And so the next article I want to cover is from the Journal of Marital and Family Therapy, and they look back at drug abuse and did a review from 2003 to 2010. And so their findings really concluded that well, I'll just read it to you because that helps me out. Several decades of consistent research findings support the reciprocal relationship between family functioning and drug abuse. Drug abuse is now understood to be initiated and maintained as a result of multiple interacting factors within the individual as well as the family, peer and social, neighborhood community systems. Family functioning is significantly compromised in turn by the individual's drug use, maintaining a corrosive and often multi-generational cycle of addiction and related problems. Family factors including parental psychopathology, family conflict, relational distance, and parenting deficits are all strong predictors of drug use initiation and abuse. Prevention research also strongly implicates the protective roles of families. Positive parenting across developmental outcome domains include reducing drug involvement. Why did I read that? Well, coming back to it is the family is going to be an integral part of anyone who is going to be struggling with any type of addiction or addictive like behaviors. One of the things that concluded in that research article was that most drug abuse tends to be in adolescence. And so that's why a lot of prognosis or a lot of treatment is geared towards adolescents, is to have hopefully a better outcome and a better achievement, that they don't create an onset of a disorder. And therefore, what we say is recreating the same dynamic or the same stress that could lead to their future kids having an addiction or some type of using behavior. Now, all that being said is, could there be a difference in the fact of if I grew up with someone who uses alcohol, does that mean I'm going to be an alcoholic? In my understanding and the way I've looked at it and treated it, no. But I would be very wary and cautious is because there are definitely things and factors that have come into play that would help make sense of why you would use alcohol, why it would be there. So really, again, going back to it is addiction is an intimacy disorder. Right now we have a lonely generation that is growing up and really is not as connected as we used to be compared to 20, 30 years ago. And I know, obviously, amidst all this COVID crisis of how even just basic interaction, human interaction is limited because we don't want to spread the virus and we really want to be respectful of those around us. And so even as I'm speaking now, I'm not present, but I know it's limiting and this video will never trump any face-to-face interaction. It just won't. So again, looking at that, and then the last component is the family unit. Very integral, very important, but also one of the biggest predicting factors of if someone is going to have an addiction. And so as we're kind of talking about it, there are different levels of attachment that I've worked with my boys and helping them understand. And why I bring up attachment, again, is about what is the relationship between me and my child. So for those of you who know me, you know I have a son. His name is Dean. And right now he's 19 months. He's very fun. He's very playful. He loves his nan and pop. He feels very comfortable with them. We are trying to create what is a healthy and secure attachment with my son. In the fact of I'm trying to create an environment where he feels very comfortable to be vulnerable, upset, but also me as a parent to be very consistent and have the structure set in place for him of he knows what's the sandbox that he can play in, and being very consistent with our punishment and how we raise him, but also just simple conversations, simple things that we are trying to help again teach him. I tie that all back into the fact of when children grow up with inconsistencies or chaos, as we're going to see a little bit later, those are also predicting factors of someone who would be susceptible to any type of substance use or an addiction behavior. That really is culminating back to my role as a parent in the environment that he grows up in. And so my first thing, as I've kind of been discussing, is parents, your role is very important for your child in understanding the type of environment you create. And so that's just one of the first points of many points that hopefully I will make in this video. So let's talk a little bit about the two types of addiction. What I've dealt with and what I've seen is there we have substance, and that is your typical drugs, alcohol, nicotine. You throw caffeine in there. Those are going to be the things that we take in that are going to heighten or give us a level of high. And that's something that we can really kind of step away from, avoid, and not have to use again, right? That's why there's substance use disorders, is because you kind of need it. The other aspect is what we call processing addictions. This is where it's a little more difficult and a little bit harder at times, mainly for the fact of you have to have a healthier relationship with the behaviors in this. So for example, when I've worked with past clients, I've worked with money, sexual addictions, and also food. Of those three, you can't really not have a relationship with them to some capacity. You need money to eat or just to live. Food, I mean, you need daily sustenance. And so when we're looking at those types of process addictions, what we're really trying to look at is what has been the relationship with that addiction. How has it hindered you? What ways has it helped you? And what do you actually get from it? And so, again, we're looking at, okay, you're not going to be able to say, I'm never going to live without money again. But you don't also need 50 pairs of shoes, or you don't need this brand new car if your family's not, surviving, or they don't have food on the table. And we look at those types of things and really try to help create a better understanding of your relationship with it, but also how it impacted you. So there's a lot of complexity that goes into that. What I'm hoping to do is I want to first talk about this aspect of just substance use disorder for this first video. And then hopefully, in the next video, I'm going to be talking about process addictions, but I'm also going to go into more in depth of a little bit of underlying issues that maybe persist and create some processing addictions, but also why the issues are still there. So let's dive into a little bit of what addiction really is. So from the National Institute of Drug Association, addiction is defined as a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite its adverse consequences. When I say that, we're going to go through the criteria, but as it kind of states right there is a persistent desire to use even despite the natural consequences. There's going to be a different signs that you're going to see for someone who is dealing with an addiction. Some examples might be severe mood swings. Working with my boys, I definitely know they're a little bit more irritable than most people. And the reason why is because they're kind of in a pendulum swing of they get into what we call an addictive cycle. So really they're trying to maintain a high and then they come off of it, the low. So they're really angry because they're not high. But when they're high, they're happy, they feel good, there's a euphoric effect. So that is again something that they crave, they want to be in, but it can only be sustained for so long. And then they come back down. And they're upset and they're angry again. Another example might be changes in behavior, such as your sleeping, your hygiene, your eating patterns. Maybe your son or daughter, sorry, I've worked with so many sons, I'm used to saying sons. Maybe your child is so used to getting up later, they sleep in more. Now, I'm not, hear me first, not because your child is sleeping in or are they using, but over a consistent pattern of time, you're going to see a consistent schedule of they're not waking up, maybe even past like noon, and it feels off. or they're changing in their eating habits of maybe they're not eating as much. You've seen a significant drop in their weight, or the fact their hygiene is, again, not really what we would like it to be. It's not healthy. They're not really taking care of themselves. They're forgetting basic things, brushing teeth, taking that shower, or just changing clothes, right? I know some of this we can say like, oh, they're growing up, adolescents, and they're learning. That's true. But what you want to be aware of is what is the, again, consistent behavior that you're seeing across the board. Now, those are just some examples. I could go into other aspects, but that's going to really highlight into our criteria that we're going to be looking at here in just a moment. So I mentioned earlier, what are external factors that really might help in someone having an addiction? So the National Institute on Drug Abuse talks about really four main areas. They talk about the family and the home, as I've kind of mentioned before from the Journal of Marital Family Therapy. They mention peers and social, early use, and how the drug is taken. And so when we look at, I'm looking at my computer screen, when we're looking at the home and the environment, one of the predicting factors is parents or older siblings who are using substances in the home or are misusing alcohol, prescription pills, can be an increase in a child's future in potentially partaking in that. Common sense really kind of comes back to accessibility is going to be a big factor. If you have something that's accessible, there is probably a chance that you increase the risk of a child using it. So that is just common knowledge there of your accessibility of certain things is, yeah, could be potentially there. The second that they talk about is peers and social settings. Our peers are some of our biggest influences when we start hitting a developmental point. I think it's probably around 13 and maybe a little bit older, but right there is when we start looking to our peers to really try to gain some of our own autonomy, but also they're the most influencing factors. I know growing up, I love my mom and dad, but they were not the most important people, like what was cool and who, how to talk, the slang, all of that. That's, again, no different than kind of kids growing up today is what are some of those factors of what is cool, what's not, who do we listen to, type of music, type of clothes, all that comes into play. And as we get older, obviously we understand to a certain capacity, those things are not as important. We still desire a relationship, but we get more comfortable in our own skin. So when you're a young adolescent and you're not really comfortable in your own skin, you're going to want to fit in. You're going to want to engage and be part of the group. Now, thankfully, there are some kids who don't go with it, who don't go with the flow, who can stand up. Some kids, that's not as true. And I don't fault them for that. It really is about wanting to have a connection, wanting to have a relationship, wanting to fit in. And so are there times that in the past, boys I've worked with who have been offered a cigarette, a vape, or a blunt for marijuana? They really didn't want to smoke, but they also did not want to be that kid who didn't fit in, who was the weird kid. And they wanted to have a relationship with their peers. So again, I say that because peers are very influential in that aspect, but also too of what is going through a child's mind of I want to fit in, I want to feel connected. The next thing is, like I already said, early use. And so obviously at any age that you're going to be, if you partake in using substances, there's always the potential to have a substance use disorder. However, when we definitely look at children, they have the developing brain. As a kind of mentioned a little bit, we have, or let's say kids have neuroplasticity in their head. They're very malleable, very changeable, and they're still developing, they're still growing. So one of the things we're going to talk about just real briefly is what is called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is in the front part of your brain, and it's where you make decisions. So children are developing their decision-making process. They're not going to make always the best decision. So now imagine introducing a substance that is going to, A, deter and cause harmful effects to that development. But now it's also going to impair their decision-making process, which is some of the difficulties I've faced with the client population I'm working with is they've put themselves in very harmful situations. They are continuing in a behavior that's very detrimental to their lives, but they're still having a difficult time of, I don't get why this is a big deal. It's just weed. It's not that big of a deal. Well, you're in treatment, so obviously to us, logically, it's a big deal. But to them, it's not registering, it's not clicking, it's not making sense. Now, to some capacity, they do understand to a certain level of, yeah, my decisions are impactful. But then there's still a desire to continue to use. The last thing that it talks about is the way it's used. So whether through smoking, so inhaling, or through needles, its addictive potential increases exponentially. And that rush of pleasure is going to be very hard to combat. One of the things that we talk about, and I know I'm going to get into it again a little bit later, is the keyword that we're going to say is dopamine. It's a natural part of the brain. It's a natural pleasure reward neurotransmitter that gets released. And so when we think about drugs and substances, it's also going to release some dopamine. And I'm going to go more into that a little bit later. First, let's go back to just addiction. So we've really talked about some early signs of what could be there. Again, changes in mood, changes in sleeping hygiene, eating behaviors. Maybe I'll throw this in. Maybe some need for money or always out of money. Like there's a constant need. So here are the criteria for addictions from the DSM-5. This is the book right here, and I was looking at it briefly a little bit earlier. The main reason why I have this, as any good clinician does, is really to help diagnose and appropriately assess the client and the situation they're in, but also to, if I were to make a diagnosis and my client leaves to go elsewhere to see another therapist or just moves, now we have a similar diagnosis to help that therapist work with the client, really help them understand this is what they've been working on and what they've really been having issues with. Now, in the DSM, it talks about the actual use disorder. It talks about intoxication. It talks about withdrawal. So there's 3 diagnoses within each of those substance use disorders that they look at. And I'll kind of go into the classes here in just a minute. But again, I share that because this is really the information I'm pulling from as to what is the criteria for addiction. So it's not my personal opinion, not my personal belief, but what the American Psychiatric Association has really said. This is the criteria for anyone who is meeting an addiction. So that's what we're going to go with, and that's what we're going to look at. So there's 11 criteria for people to meet, or 11 symptoms, and we'll kind of talk about how many they have to meet to get a diagnosis. But the criteria are the substance is taken in larger amounts or over a longer period of time than was intended. There is a persistent desire or unsuccessful effort to cut down on the use. The next one is that a great deal of time is spent in activities necessary to obtain, use, or recover from the effects of the substance. Cravings or a strong desire or urge to use. A recurrent use resulting in failure to fulfill major obligations at work, school, or home. Continued use despite having recurring or persistent social or interpersonal problems caused by or exacerbated by the effects of the substance. important social, occupational, or recreational activities that are given up or reduced because of the use. Recurrent use in situations in which it is physically hazardous. What they're talking about in that is a overdose or driving while intoxicated or driving under the influence, blacking out, those types of physically hazardous, dangerous. Use is continued despite knowledge of having persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problems that is likely to have been caused or exacerbated by the substance. And then the last two, one is tolerance. So again, a need or increase for amounts to achieve the intoxication or a desired effect, but also a diminished effect with continued use over the same amount of time. And then withdrawals. And withdrawals can look very different depending on the substance use, but sometimes, again, this is the changes in mood, irritability, anxiety, maybe depressed mood, changes in eating and sleeping habits. I know working with my clients, some of them have gone through the withdrawal effects, and so they feel more on edge. But over time, they start to they feel better. But initially during that withdrawal phase, it can be the shakiness, the nervous sweats, the cold sweats. All that again is part of the criteria for meeting an addiction. So why do I again bring this up? We're going back to this idea and this mentality that this substance is taking a large part of our time. It is taken away from important things around us, or it's affecting our work, it's affecting our relationships, and we are still continuing to use it despite those consequences. When I've lost my job, when I've lost my relationship, or when I'm lying about, yes, I'm going to pick you up at this time, but I'm actually going out and getting what I need. Or the fact of you have been arrested, you have a DUI, you lost your license, and yet logically, some of us would say, okay, I messed up and I need to stop. But you're still persisting, you're still using, and it's still putting you in dangerous situations. All again, what we're talking about is I have kind of fallen under its wing. I really can't stop. And that's one of the, again, criteria is I've had a desire and I've tried to stop, but I can't stop. So those are some of the 11 criteria to me. Now, before I get any further, I want to be very clear again of what we're going to look at is what is actually going to be a substance use disorder for this video. And so it's broken up into kind of really 3 categories, and I could have included a little bit more, but I felt like these were probably the most important. And so when we look at substance use disorders, it's broken down into mild, moderate, and severe. And so mild is going to be 2 to 3 symptoms are present. Okay, so maybe you are missing important social activities or events, and you have withdrawal effects, right? 2 criteria right there, mild. Moderate is going to say 4 to 5 symptoms are present, okay? So some of the symptoms are more exacerbated. You're going to meet more of the criteria. And then severe are 6 or more symptoms present. Now, why I'm bringing this up again is one, a mental health professional, a doctor, they're going to be best assessing of, okay, this is someone who has mild symptoms, moderate, or severe. I talk about that is because mainly they're going to be the best one to assess someone who is going to need maybe a higher level of care and someone who may be able to do this on what we call an outpatient level. So all that again is saying of there are people who definitely struggle with different types of substances and need help. But I really have a hard time classifying the person, and I'll use alcohol for this example, really have a hard time classifying the person who drinks once a month in the same category as the person who drinks every day, right? Common sense, we're not going to say they match in any way. And so we want to be very careful on how we look at and see really who has an addiction and who really is needing help, but also too that if someone is struggling and someone is wanting help with a substance, that they get the appropriate care and that it's not, overreacted to. So again, all that is just to help give a clarity is if you have concern about yourself or a loved one, I've mentioned the criteria and you can Google these things and kind of find out, or you can go to a local counselor and talk about that with them of what's the best way to maybe help someone that you might be concerned about. And they're going to help walk you through and help you really understand, well, what are the behaviors? What are the things that you're seeing, right? And really, again, help best assess of what is the actual behavior going on in that manner. So I want to go back to the different types of substance use disorders. So you got your big main three. You've got alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis. Those are very common, very prevalent in America, and two of them, are probably the most common out of any of them, which is, I'm thinking more so about alcohol and tobacco. The other type of use disorders that I've included are stimulant use disorder. This is Adderall, Ritalin, cocaine. Again, hijacks the body and really heightens your awareness and focus in a rush, as they call it. Hallucinogen, this is LSD, peyote. And really, again, some euphoric effects and kind of seeing images or hallucinating things that aren't really there. Hallucinogen use disorder. And then opioid use disorder, hydrocodone, Oxycontin, prescription type pills. And really, that's to kind of give some clarity as well as to what substance use disorders are in there. Now, there are other unspecified substance use disorder in that current section. Gambling is part of it. Caffeine withdrawal is another part that's in there too. So yes, caffeine, I love coffee myself, so I'm preaching to the choir here, but there can be a thing as too much coffee. It is true. If you are meeting some of the 11 criteria of too much coffee, too much caffeine, you might want to look at it. And all that is saying if you're getting irritable and upset because you haven't had your coffee, some mood swings, or you find yourself craving it more and you can't go without it, again, you might just want to look at your intake. Not a bad thing. But I know also with caffeine intake, it can help increase your anxiety. If you are drinking too much of it to where you may feel more anxious and not realize it, or if you feel more calm with it, it's kind of in no way different of the stimulant use of what are you really using it for. So all that being said, is just something to think about and to look at. Now, the next little portion I'm going to cover real fast is another research-based company, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They conduct a study, and this past recent one was in 2018. And so I'm going to read a couple of the numbers that they had, that they posted from their findings. So just to give clarity, the US Census at that time found that we had 327.2 million people in America, right? 327.2 million. I want that number just to be in your minds for a second. So of that, 7.8%, so that's 19.3 million people aged 18 or older had a substance use disorder. So that's 3 and 8. Sorry, they broke it down in little categories. 3 and 8, or 7.4, struggle with illicit drugs. So that's going to be marijuana, opioids, stimulants, hallucinogens. Those are the illicit drugs they're talking about. 3 and 4, 14.4 million struggle with alcohol use. and then 1 in 8, or 2.5 million, struggle with both. Those are big numbers to me, and honestly, a little concerning in the fact of, okay, if 3 in 8 people are struggling with illicit drug use, or 3 in 4 are struggling with alcohol use, it's a very common thing, and that's just including 18 and older. It's not really looking at 18 and younger. And you can look on this website again and find it yourself and look at it. But I bring up those numbers again because part of that is there's a large population that is struggling with some type of substance use disorder. And it needs to be treated because they're also impacting the people around us and impacting our communities, but also they're impacting their own family, their own homes, which may continue the use of any type of addictive behaviors moving forward. Let's talk about the effects of drugs. From the National Institute of Drug Abuse, again, another great research and really great source of information if you want a better clarity, and articles that they have on substance use, but also they can help you give charts on the substance use that mainly is higher in your state. I know you could find it on Arkansas. The same with the other one. But what they talk about is the use and misuse of alcohol, nicotine, illicit drugs, prescription pills cost Americans more than $700 billion a year in increased healthcare costs, crime, and lost productivity. Every year, illicit prescription drugs and alcohol contribute to more than 90,000 American deaths, while tobacco is linked to an estimated 480,000 per year. The numbers don't lie. There is a real issue with that. There is a concern. So when we're talking about, they have a little bit of a drinking problem. Well, I want us to be very considerate of the fact of, they have a drinking problem. We don't want them to be part of the numbers. And when you think about, I honestly think about the families I've worked with, of the effects, the costs of just going through treatment, outpatient therapy, the legal aspect of hiring lawyers, or going through probation and then getting back on probation just once you have gotten off of it, drug testing, all that going into it. That's just the financial cost. But then also think about the emotional consequence of most of the parents I've worked with is the emotional fatigue of dealing with a son who is dealing with addiction, dealing with a son that you're trying to help, you really understand this is not going to help you. This is really detrimental to your life, and they don't get it. They don't understand it. They actually get more upset, more frustrated with you about it, and they push you away. Now, again, in my next video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the reasonings underlying the addiction. But coming back to just the basic cost and the basic understanding of this is a lot. And so, someone's drinking could be problematic because they may be part of your family that, one, it's very difficult maybe to be around them emotionally. It's fatigue, it's exhausting. But also, too, I really think about the children in that home, of if someone is using, again, substances or alcohol or nicotine, they're also having an impact on the people, mainly their children, and creating a little bit of chaos for them. And so we want to be mindful of that. So when we look at how it really affects different populations, so the National Institute on Drug Abuse really looks at teens, adults, parents, and infants. And the one thing I'm really going to highlight is just little blips from each of them, but these are very common in mostly all of them. So obviously when we're talking about teens or adults, especially with teens, it's going to affect their education, may cause them to drop out. Their brain, like I've already said, is really developing, so it's going to hinder their development, impact that prefrontal cortex, that decision-making process. and also put them at higher risk for continuing in a substance use disorder down the road. Now, poor decision-making process, as we all know, can lead to poor decisions, driving under the influence, increased risk of possibly STDs or other sexual acting out behaviors, pregnancies, um, loss of a job, um, loss of family relationship. So all of that again is saying there's a higher risk, and why we really look at teenagers or young adolescents is really trying to get them to help so they don't have to deal with some of these natural consequences down the road. Because right now they're not in a state where their decision-making process is at its best. That's not across the board for everybody, but it is immature compared to someone who is in their 40s. Much different. For adults, if they continue in this, they're going to have thinking, memory problems. They're going to have issues paying attention. They also may suffer in social situations, and it really does affect their own personal and work performances. So, like we said with the teens, so if they continue in this trend, it's also going to set them up down the road to not really what we want to have is really a healthy and successful life. Not in any way of you're making six figures and all that, but really to have the opportunity of what we're all guaranteed in America is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so, as an adult, if you're continuing with the substance use disorder, there is the struggle of just maintaining a job or having healthier relationships with maybe your kids or your spouse or your partner. And some of the substances is hindering those things, right? That's part of some of the natural effects. For parents, as I've kind of mentioned before, if you're using substances, I can understand if it's a way to cope, it's a way to deal with stress, but it's also creating a very chaotic environment for your children. It's making it very difficult to be a consistent parent. It's also showing your kids of when you feel stressed, when you feel upset, or this is how we maybe celebrate, how we party, or maybe you're enabling the behavior and then they get caught in that behavior of working obviously with a young clientele population. There's been many different times or cases where they may have alluded or really just kind of discussed of like, yeah, I drank with my parents. That was something we did and it was okay. But then it sends a very confusing message down the road of, well, then you got arrested for drinking because you were underage. But mom and dad said it was okay. And so you can kind of see how that is going to bind someone and be very confusing of it's okay in this area, but not in this. But then we get upset with them because they acted out like this. So again, part of that is you need to be very clear and consistent on what you're presenting to your children. But I would also say too, it can also be very damaging if you're inconsistent with that and very have enabling behaviors with your child. So that's another aspect. The last one is probably one of the most important ones for me, but also a little bit sad too, is I think about infants. Children who are growing in the womb who don't really have much control. Children even younger, or say toddlers, because I'm thinking about my son, he's 19 months. Yeah, it would be detrimental if there were any substance use behaviors that he was around, but I could also kind of bring him out of that. However, again, for infants, they don't have any control. They're literally dependent upon their mother to help give them nourishment, to help bring them into this world. So if they're in an environment where they are using or participating in substances, it's going to affect them. And some of the aspects may be a premature or underweight birth. That's a scary thought of your child being in the NICU and because they're premature. Now, that's going to be obviously difficult because then they're going to lose out on what we call as healthy touch, healthy attachment. Usually that begins first thing when a child is born and they're placed on their mother's chest, creating that sense of attachment. And so even then, they're missing out on that process. And then you can look at different aspects of when they're born, maybe fetal alcohol syndrome. It's in the name, but high intakes of certain substances can lead to higher increase of mental retardation or any other processing or developmental disorders that your child is going to have to undergo. And it really comes back to you have participated in something that is going to affect them. And that comes back to understanding and really knowing why you're using the substance, but also to thinking about the people around you it's going to affect. So kind of continuing on, we really talk about the prefrontal cortex and that maturity and that development, but as people who continue in using some of that, it definitely affects the decision making process, but also the critical judgment, learning, memory, and behavior control. So that's why we can really look again back at some of these compulsive behaviors, because they've been hindered. They're not on par and really have a better understanding because they're developmentally delayed because of that substance use. Really, when we look at it, the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully mature and develop until about 26. The latest I've read is about 28. All in all, again, saying that is, okay, I'm not expecting my young adolescent males to be the best decision-making process. And this is by far without any substance use. But when I add that, I'm even going to take it a step back of, I know that they're not mature enough to make a decision. And so we look at it as, okay, when you have someone who may be 15 and you throw in a substance, you're going to take them back a couple of years. They may be 11 or 12. And that's the sad part of it, but they, maturity-wise, are not making rational decisions, rational choices. And so we need to be very mindful and aware of that, but also understanding of we're asking them to make a decision, and our expectation as they come and understand themselves better increases. But also it's difficult because they've not made this kind of decision before. And so that again is just another aspect that I'm highlighting here. So the last little thing about brain functioning that I'm going to cover is really the dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter, and it's something that we naturally have again. It's part of the pleasure reward center. So we naturally get these things from daily activities, from spending time with family, maybe doing an activity like working out, going kayaking, hiking, food, certain types of food, maybe you get a little bit more of an excitement about. I know I enjoy a good home cooked meal. And I know when Jen and I go out to a local restaurant here, yeah, I enjoy a good meal. So I get dopamine release from that. So what I want you to be thinking about is then when the brain is introduced to substance, it's a flooding of that dopamine. One research that we kind of look at and have noted is people who have seen pornography, again, another process addiction, and people who have used cocaine, they're 1100% increase in dopamine release. So the spending time with family may be registered as like 5-10 dopamine release. So you can kind of see the numbers. They're different. And so when I've achieved that high, this high up here, it has now set the standard of I want to get back to it. It's also wired in my brain, the neural pathways of, ooh, that was nice, that was good. Let's go back to that. And why I used it may have been because I'm stressed, may have been because I'm upset, may have been because I'm happy. Sometimes I've, working with addiction as long as I have, it's it's not really maybe a negative aspect, but it was just like that's what we did when we were working hard. Work hard, play hard is sometimes a common saying that gets thrown around. And so the why I used has now connected in my brain the neural pathways of this is the reason why I do it, because it brings me this release of dopamine. So now my brain is geared and set to fire in such a way. So another example that we use is I want you to imagine a grass field. If you start walking in a field every day a certain way, you're going to start to tread and leave a path. That's true. Well, let's say you want to make it a little bit easier on yourself. You pour a little gravel. Well, now it's easier, but you got to maintain it every now and then. But it's much easier than to walk on the grass. You don't have to worry about weeds growing up. Well, let's just say you're more now desirable of a concrete pathway. That's what you want. That's the same way an addiction works. And as older you get, the more your brain becomes like concrete with those neural pathways, which why makes it the compulsive behavior so hard to fight, but also why it's really hard and difficult as the older you get to work with those. I'm not saying you're not helped, you can't be helped, but it definitely is harder to undo some of those because the neuroplasticity, the brain matter that's malleable, is not as great when you're older as when you are younger, which is why the Journal of Marital and Family Therapy really talks about more prognosis and more treatment, more preventative actions are being in place now to help and assist with young adolescents who are engaging or initiating any types of substance use behavior. So we're not having to work on it on the back end. So I want you to be thinking about that as another example of when you're thinking about someone with an addiction, think about how concretized their brain is, but also understand that it's going to take a little bit. It's not going to be a quick fix. It never is. And so one of the more things I want to end on is lastly, what you can be doing is about recovery is a process. It's a choice. That's always the way I've seen it. That's always the way I believe in it. There are different things that you can be doing to help the people around you. So if you have a family member or you have someone that you know or you personally are struggling with an addiction, my first thing is going to say is go talk with a local mental health professional. Really help understand of what are the issues that you are currently struggling with, but also so you can get the appropriate care and help that you need. Not everybody needs a level of residential care, but maybe the issues you're struggling with as well can't be met on an outpatient basis. There are different types of program. The other aspect is really attending a type of recovery meeting. There are Celebrate Recovery meetings, and those are very helpful, and they do kind of a difference of group meetings, and I've heard those have been very helpful for past clients who have used them. And then you have your typical Alcoholics Anonymous, your AA, your NA, which is Narcotics Anonymous, your SA, Sex Anonymous. Again, some of those groups are going to be very helpful in using the recovery mindset. Typically, when we look at clients who are trying to deal with any substance use, there's a mindset of 90 meetings in 90 days. And that is a choice that you're making to continue to participate in a recovery process. The 12 steps are very helpful and very useful. The first thing in the 12 step is admitting that you are powerless and yielding to something greater than yourself, right? That in and of itself is about a choice of I'm choosing to yield. And most people choose God, and some don't, but I'm choosing to yield to something greater than myself so I can get the help that I need. And another group that's called Al-Anon, but it's for families that have someone who is in addiction. Really helpful to be meeting with other people who kind of get it. So when you are thinking about Okay, Craig, that's helpful. But what really is my role to maybe best help is um, in helping them maintain sobriety. Well, honestly, it's going to be part of what their work is with their local therapist or with their psychiatrist or with their doctor, what they're kind of recommending. But the biggest thing too is really want to differentiate what is responsibility for and responsibility to. So parents, you are responsible for your kids. You are until they reach a certain age. Typically, we look at that as being 18. But your responsibility for them when they're under, yeah, you're responsible to help feed them, clothe them, provide for them to a certain capacity. Now, what does that mean? You're not really responsible to provide them a new vehicle. Those might be some of the natural consequences if they're continuing to act out or use substances. And I say that as a motivator of helping the behavior change. Now, if they continue to persist, the natural consequences come into play. The other aspect is the natural consequences. If your child or your son is in an addiction or in a behavior and they're still persistent and you have tried to help them, you've tried to encourage them, you've tried to get them help and they're still persisting, that's where I would recommend the fact of let natural consequences come into play. I say that is more so the fact of if someone is one driving under the influence and is arrested, they need to know that their choices have actions. And they need to feel the experience of losing their license. One is because I don't want someone who's driving under the influence to continue to drive. Just for me and my family, I don't want that. I want you on the road. Sorry, I'm a little biased in that aspect. So if you lose your license and have to feel the effects and go through all the mandates to get back to a license, the hope is that you hopefully understood why you consisted continuing the behavior, but also you understand too this is the natural consequence. Like if you do these things, you're going to feel these things. So I would much rather this person get arrested, lose their license, than them later feel the effects of they were driving while intoxicated and they ran into someone and killed the other person. Too often we hear those stories, but also the effect that would have on someone of I'm now left with this. Like I have hurt and have damaged another family. I'm responsible for that. And so I don't want anyone to have to go through that. I don't want to have two families go through such a terrible and painful experience because it's not fun. It's not fair. So let natural consequences come into play. Two, if you're enabling the behaviors, stop. Don't enable them. And the fact of if you're buying and providing for them, stop. Don't do it. Now it may be hard and it may be difficult what that looks like, and you may get some pushback and some anger and some frustration, which is normal because you're providing that. But have a clear expectation of what you want, and if they're not willing to abide, this is what's going to happen. Maybe you move out, maybe they cannot live in your home anymore, but obviously you would have a plan in place in preparation to remove yourself from the situation if they're continuing to live in such a behavior. Again, this is about taking care of yourself, but also if children are involved, it's about taking care of them. They don't need to grow up with that chaotic environment. And actually, you're helping them understand that there are boundaries in place that we all have to abide by, and that people's behaviors do matter. Your choices do matter, and you can have consequences for that. If you don't, then you could be setting up a very confusing narrative or confusing thought process for them of, well, why can't I act this way? Why can't I do this? We let mom or dad do this. And then we're going to be angry and frustrated with them. Well, that's different. It's not. It's really the same thing. They're just utilizing it. So that would be another thing is really don't, first of all, let natural consequences apply. Don't enable the behaviors, but really take care of the people around you. Mainly, again, thinking about the children that are involved. Those are kind of three ways that I've seen and really try to talk with my parents and work with them on. But also, again, remind them that recovery is a choice and that person who wants help will get help. Now, the best thing about how do I want them to get help. You can be supportive, you can be encouraging. I would also always defer back to, okay, if someone is struggling with a desire that they want to drink, you can ask them, be supportive in a way of, what do you need from me? What do you need to go for a drive? Do you need to get out of the house? If they're feeling what we call triggered, and this is just a heightened awareness. Yeah, I need those things. Being supportive might also just be a 30-minute phone call of, hey, what's going on? I'm feeling like this, I'm really stressed, and I want to buy this. Okay, well, let's talk about it, or let's get you out of there. Or maybe deferring back to their sponsor. If someone is participating in 12-step meetings, at some point they have got a sponsor, so they can lean upon their recovery community and be calling them and assisting. And all that being said is it's not going to be one person's job to help this person. It really is more of a community aspect, and the fact of they're connected with a therapist or a psychiatrist or a doctor or a licensed clinical social worker. They're working with someone to help them understand the issues that they're working on for the reasons for the addiction. Two, they're participating in a type of recovery community, and they're gaining relationship with other people who are striving for the same thing. It's much easier to do recovery when you have people who are in the same boat. It's really hard when you're trying to do it by yourself. You really can't do this alone, which is a big stress that I come back to. And three, it's about responsibility 2 and responsibility 4. Knowing your role in your partner or your spouse's situation or your child's recovery process is really knowing what your role is in helping them achieve the desired goal, which is sobriety, but also a different life, a different way of living, which all comes back to any addiction I see is an intimacy disorder. And so we're going to come back to next week in what the underlying issues that maybe maintain and keep that behavior going, but also what is left untreated if not. And I'm going to also, like I said, come back to processing addictions and what that looks like. So my biggest thing is I first want to again say thank you for allowing me to speak. Thank you for listening to my presentation. If you have questions or anything like that, please feel free to email. My email is cwilliams@capstonetc.com. If you have questions, now I again will try to help in the best way I can. But my biggest thing is I'm probably going to ask and defer that you find the help that you need with a local mental health professional in your area. Charlie Jackson, I know, recently spoken. He may be someone. There's Families Inc. in Jonesboro. And so I would be utilizing those resources and talking to someone if you are currently struggling or have a family member who is struggling with an addiction. So I hope you all have a good night, and I look forward to talking to you all next week. And good night.